Assalamu alaikum. In this video, we will discuss the part 1 of forearm anatomy, and you will find the pages on your textbooks and also attached PDF file with the video. أهم الأهداف اللي نحتاج نعرفها بنهاية المحاضرة اللي هي first identify features of bones of the forearm, recognize muscles compartments of the forearm, study the muscles of the anterior compartment including origin, insertion, nerve supply, and action, and to identify neurovascular supply of the anterior compartment, and we're going to discuss and study the nerves and arteries of the anterior compartment. So to start with, we have the bones of the forearm. As we already know, we have two parallel bones. Medially we have the ulna and laterally we have the radius. We have studied the proximal ends of the ulna and radius, and we've mentioned that the ulna is proximally expanded while the radius is small and narrow. We have olecranon process posteriorly and trochlear notch for the articulation with the trochlea of the humerus, and anteriorly we have the coronoid process. As we go down, we have the tuberosity of the ulna, if you remember, for the insertion of brachialis muscle of the arm, and we've got the shaft, and distally we have the head. The head of ulna is distally while the head of radius is proximally. The shaft of the ulna is triangular in the cross section. If we cut it transversely, we have triangles with three borders and three surfaces. اللي يهمنا بالحقيقة هو الميديال border of the ulna, which is called the interosseous border, because it is the lateral, lateral border of the ulna, because this is the border where the interosseous membrane attaches. This is a sharp border, lateral border of the ulna called interosseous border. The second important border is the posterior border, which extends from the olecranon process downward along the entire length of the ulna. And this border is subcutaneous and can be palpated by the hand. So this is important. We can palpate the olecranon. إذا تجرب تشوف على الforearm from the tip of the elbow joint, and you go downward along the entire length of the forearm. This is the posterior subcutaneous border of the ulna. Distally, however, we have a rounded head, narrow, and there is a bony projection on the medial aspect called the ulnar styloid process. Radius, however, we have the head of radius, a narrow neck, and the head is articulating with the radial notch on the lateral aspect of the coronoid process, and a narrow neck, وعندنا هنا radial tuberosity for the insertion of biceps brachii, and we have also a triangular shaped shaft when we cut it, when we have a cross section. So we have three borders. We have the medial border اللي هو يقابل meets the lateral border of the ulna, and also it's called interosseous borders. And we have anterior border, which has an oblique shaped, oblique يعني منحني, so this is called oblique line. And the posterior border, which is covered by muscles and we cannot palpate it through the skin. Distally, the distal part of the radius is expanded مثل ما نشوف، فكأنما الراديوس هو عكس الألنا، كأنه الراديوس هو ulna مقلوب، لأن the proximal end of the ulna is expanded while the distal end is narrow. This distal end is called head of ulna, while the proximal end is narrow of the radius, which is called head and neck, and the distal end is expanded. It has four surfaces, and the anterior surface is somehow smooth, while posterior surface is rough مثل ما نشوف هنا, big grooves, and we have a distinct dorsal tubercle that we can palpate through the skin. Uh, Medially, we have the ulnar notch for the articulation of the head of ulna, forming the distal radio-ulnar joints, which is the counterpart of the proximal axil proximal radio-ulnar joint اللي يتكون between the head of the radius and the radial notch on the proximal ulna. This is formed by the head of ulna medially and the ulnar notch on the medial aspect of the distal radius. The type of these joints is pivot, مثل ما نعرف, pivot joint. At this joint we have the movement of pronation and supination that we will discuss later. The distal surface of the radius is formed by two articular impressions, فد بصمات للarticulation with the carpal bones. ونتذكر ان the bones of the wrist joint, we call them carpal bones. We have 8 bones that we will study later, inshallah. And we've also got an articular disc that attaches the medial aspect of the radius with the styloid process of the ulna. هذا articular disc يفصل لي الhead of ulna from the carpal bones. So the articulation between the distal end of the radius with the bones of the carpal bones, forming the wrist joint. هنا راح يصير wrist joint. On the lateral aspect of the distal radius, we have also a bony projection that resembles the ulnar styloid process, called the radial styloid process. However, the radial styloid process is longer and larger than the ulnar styloid process. Finally, we have the interosseous membrane that binds the radius with the ulna. هذا الانتروسيوس membrane راح يسوي لي ذول two bones as a single unit. وحدة كاملة لهذا الموفمنت خاصة بال flexion and extension, as well as pronation and supination. We move the forearm as a single unit, as a single structure, not two bones and two structures. Interosseous membrane begins from تقريبا proximal third, and we have a free proximal edge or margin, هذا الحادة اللي هي proximal, and the fibers directs from lateral to medial downward in an oblique fashion, بصورة منحنية, and it continues distally. Also, we have in the lower third of the forearm, we have an aperture, an opening in the interosseous membrane that allows for the passage of structures to pass between the front aspect and the back aspect of the forearm. So in order to study the muscles in the anterior compartment of forearm, or in forearm in general, we need to study the bones of the hand and carpal bones, because the insertions and attachment of the bones of the muscle, بالforearm راح تجيني هنا. I need to study the bones of the carpal bones and the bones of the hand. Carpal bones, we have 8 bones arranged in 2 rows مترتبة بصفين. Proximal row, and remember this is proximal area and this is distal, and distal row. عندنا 4 in proximal row, 4 عظام بالproximal row, and 4 in distal row. طبعا هنا نشوفها. This is called scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. التسميات صعبة، لهذا نحتاج في الطريقة حتى نحفظها. اكو هواي طرق صراحة، بس أنا برأيي الطريقة اللطيفة إنه أكو نيمونيك، أكو فد جملة تذكيرية. الجملة التذكيرية هي تقول كالتالي. طبعا arrangement of the phrase or of the mnemonic راح تبدي from lateral to medial، ونبدي بالproximal وبعدين ننزل للدistal. So the mnemonic says, she looks too pretty, try to catch her. يعني كيفكم she looks too pretty she for the scaphoid from lateral to medial, this is the distal row, looks for the lunate, T for triquetrum, P for pisiform, try to catch her, this is trapezium, trapezoid, capitate and hamate. Just to remember. طبعا the arrangement of these bones هو مو straight. The anterior aspect of these bones when they get arranged تترتب ما يكون straight, لا يكون in a form of arch with concavity becomes anterior. فعندنا anterior concavity, هذا الارش يسموه carpal arch. carpal arch concavity يكون anteriorly والconvexity يكون posteriorly. هذا الارش يكمل ب fibrous connective tissue thickening of deep fascia يربط لي ال two ends of the arch حتى يحول لي الارش إلى tunnel، إلى قناة. هذه القناة نسميها carpal tunnel، بما أنه هي الكاربال. كاربال طبعا by the way معناها wrist. كاربم أو كارباس معناها wrist. فكاربال bones هي البونز of the wrist joint، والكاربال arch هو القوس، قوس الwrist joint، and the carpal tunnel هي the wrist tunnel، قناة الwrist joint. Now the more distal bones عندنا 5 long bones. هذول أول bones اللي هم articulate with the distal row of the carpal bones نسميهم metacarpals. We have 5 metacarpals. ترقيمهم شلون نسميهم؟ ترقيمهم from the most lateral one. This is called first metacarpal bones, second, third, fourth and fifth. Okay. حتى نعرف تسميات الفingers أو الdigits، طبعا هاي يسموها fingers or digits. This is called the thumb الإبهام. This is called the index السبابة. This is called the middle الوسط. This is called the ring because we wear a ring, wedding ring or engagement ring. And the last one is called the little finger. ممكن نسميهم the first, second, fourth, fourth and fifth، أو نسميهم بتسمياتهم اللي هم ring index, middle ring, thumb index, middle ring and little. This is the first metacarpal, second, fourth and fifth. The most distal bones, also they are long bones, يعني عندهم 2 expanded epiphyses and a shaft, and this is called the bases and this is called the heads. Bases and heads. هذول اللي عندنا 3 bones in each of the medial fingers. هذول الأربعة نسميهم medial fingers, and this is the thumb. Every fingers or every digit has got 3 bones. هذول نسميهم phalanx. Single هو phalanx، الجمع نسميهم phalanges. بمعنى عندنا 3، وحدة proximal, middle, distal. عندنا 3 phalanges in each finger بالmedial 4 fingers, while the thumb has got only 2 phalanges, proximal and distal. آخر شيء نحكي بس تسميات الجوينتس. الجوينتس اللي between الcarpal bones and the metacarpal bones راح نسميه carpo-metacarpal joints. حسب التسمية، احنا عرفنا تسميات الكاربال بونز، عرفنا تسميات الميتاكاربال بونز، وعرفنا تسميات الفالنجيز. الفالنجيز قلنا الميديال 4 fingers each one has got 3 phalanges اللي هما proximal phalanx, middle phalanx and distal phalanx, while the thumb only has got only 2 phalanges. So the joints between the carpal bones and the metacarpals called carpo-metacarpals. Joints between the carpal bones and the metacarpal bones. While the joints between the metacarpals and the proximal phalanges called metacarpophalangeal. Metacarpophalangeal joints. Now, the joints between the proximal and middle phalanges خاصة بالميديال 4 fingers هذول راح نسميه proximal enter between phalangeal joints. Proximal لأنهم proximal enter between phalanges interphalangeal joints. proximal interphalangeal joints. While the distal one, you can guess, this is distal interphalangeal joints. بالثumb عندنا only one joint اللي هو اسمه interphalangeal joints of thumb because we've got only two phalanges. In your textbooks we have an in the clinic section اللي يشرح لنا بيه 3 types of fractures بالforearm. There are many types بس اللي مكتوب عندكم بالتكستبوك هو التالي. First one is the Montague's fracture. طبعا ملاحظة مهمة، احنا مثل ما شرحنا قلنا انه bones of the forearm forming a single unit by the interosseous membrane. لهذا any fracture in any one of the bones we will have either fracture in the other bone or dislocation. dislocation معناها خلع. خلع هو separation of the articulating bones completely. فعندنا complete separation، اكو ابتعاد ال articulating bones عن بعضها وانفصالها تماما. يعني ما عندي small area هنا attached لل articular surface. فعندي انفصال تام لل articulating surfaces. This is called dislocation. خلع. The first fracture called Montague's fracture. واحد اسمه Montague's عالم كسور علم الكسور. Montague's fracture اللي هو fracture in the proximal third of the ulna. This is the ulna مثل ما نعرف. This is lateral X-ray. We are looking from lateral aspect to the elbow and to the forearm. فعندي fracture proximal third of the ulna with complete dislocation of the head of the radius out of the elbow joint. This is called Montague's fracture. The opposite to the Montague's fracture is called Galeazzi's. Galeazzi, again, an Italian scientist, named this fracture after his name. Galeazzi's fracture was a fracture of distal third of the radius. Distal third of the radius. Remember, this is the radius, an expanded distal end. We had the carpal bones that we've discussed. With subluxation of ulna. شنو يعني subluxation؟ subluxation هو dislocation بس مو complete. احنا ما قلنا dislocation هو complete separation of articulating surfaces. subluxation لا partial جزئي. انفصال جزئي between the articulating surfaces. فهذا هو الجاليازيس. And lastly we have the Colles fracture. هذا very common طبعا نشوفه خاصة بالold age اللي يكون عندهم osteoporosis هشاشة عظام. هذا من الشخص fall on outstretched hand، يوقع على ايد اللي هي ممتدة، فيصير عندي fracture of radius distal end of radius and the distal fragment. هاي القطعة اللي هي distal تكون moved backward or dorsally. فمن أشوف الديفورماتي المريض يجيني على شكل ديفورماتي هذه نسميها تشبه الفورك، تشبه الشطل نسميها dinner fork deformity اللي هي dinner fork يعني شطل. الديفورماتي اللي هي شكل الإيد يشبه dinner fork. This is the Colles fracture in the radius. Now, the forearm is the region that bounded proximally by the elbow joint and distally by the wrist joint. The structure passes from the arm to the forearm through the transitional area, which is called the cubital fossa, that we already studied, the triangular space in front of the elbow joint. The structure passes from the forearm to the from the arm to the forearm and vice versa. طبعا إذا عندي nerves or lymphatics from the forearm to the arm, except for the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve will passes posterior to the medial epicondyle. فعدا ulnar nerve راح يدخل من ضمن الcubital fossa أو anterior to the elbow joint، فراح يدخل posteriorly, just posterior to the medial epicondyle. And the structure that passes from the forearm to the hand and vice versa will pass through a tunnel اللي احنا اصلا شرحناها من حكينا على البونز of the carpal area or carpal bones, which is called the carpal tunnel, that's formed by the posteriorly by the concavity of the carpal arch اللي حكيناهم اللي يسووهم الcarpal bones, and the attachment of the flexor retinaculum, هذه thickened area of deep fascia, fibrous deep fascia اللي توصل لل boundaries of the carpal arch. Now, with the presence of the two bones, radia and ulna, and the interconnecting interosseous membrane, and we have the lateral intermuscular septum, of course, we have a deep fascia that wraps the muscles of the forearm, all the forearms. مثل ما نشوف deep fascia attached to the subcutaneous or posterior border of the ulna. نشوف هنا posterior border of the ulna immediately beneath the skin, the muscle covering it. That's why I can't palpate it. With this arrangement, the muscles of the forearm is divided, or the forearm generally is divided into two compartments, just like the arm, مثل الارم اللي شفناها. فعندي anterior compartment and posterior compartment. Anterior compartment, also called flexor compartment, because it flexes the wrist, flexes the digits, while the posterior compartment is called the extensor compartment, because it extends the wrist and extends the digits or fingers. Now, for descriptive purposes, we divide the anterior compartments into three layers, the muscles of the anterior compartments into three layers. طبعا muscles the anterior compartment, they share some characteristics, عندهم فد مميزات عامة اللي هي أول شيء طبعا هم flexors, so they flexes the wrist or the fingers. They also pronate the forearm. Some muscles act as a pronators. فهذول هم وحدة الأكشن. Regarding the nerve supply, all the muscles of the anterior compartment are supplied by median nerve, except 1.5 muscles. المصل أول وحدة اللي هي called flexor carpi ulnaris، بما أنه هي اسمها ulnaris, it is supplied by the ulnar nerve. كل المسلز اللي هم 8 muscles, I have 8 muscles in the anterior compartment, كلهم supplied by the median nerve except flexor carpi ulnaris, while the half مقنص اللي هو medial half of flexor digitorum profundus, and we will study it. Just understand the outlines of the anterior compartment. فعندي المسلز anterior compartment either flexes the wrist or the fingers, or they pronate the forearm at the proximal and distal radial ulnar joints. This is number one. Number two, كل المسلز of the anterior compartment are supplied by median nerve except 1.5. One muscle اللي هي flexor carpi ulnaris, and the half, the medial half of flexor digitorum profundus, both are supplied by ulnar nerve. The third characteristics is the majority of the muscles, أغلب المسلز اللي هي موجودة بالanterior compartment, they take a common origin from the medial epicondyle. مثل ما نشوف هذه هي المسلز أغلبها ماخذة origin from a common origin from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Now, to divide the layers, أول وحدة عندنا superficial layer, intermediate layer, and lastly the deep layer. Superficial layer, we have 4 muscles اللي هما from medial to lateral, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis, and lastly pronator teres. إذا تركز شوية الأسماء راح تعطيك فكرة على الأكشن. فمثلا flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor because it flexes لأن بالanterior compartment or flexor compartment. Carpi يعني it flexes the wrist, the carpal. ulnaris لأن على جهة الألنا. flexor carpi ulnaris. palmaris longus لها علاقة بالpalm وهي longus يعني معناها هي الطويلة. Flexor carpi radialis عكس the flexor carpi ulnaris. It flexes the wrist on the radial side. And lastly, pronator teres. Pronator يعني it pronates the forearm. Intermediate layer we have only one muscle which is called the flexor digitorum superficialis, and again we can gain some clue here. Flexor it flexes, digitorum it flexes the fingers primarily. Superficialis يعني it is near the skin, بما معنى انه عندنا deeper muscle, the same action. The deep layer we have three muscles اللي هم flexor digitorum profundus. هذه اللي هي deep version of the flexor digitorum superficialis. Flexor pollicis, and the pollicis يعني thumb. نسمي الثumb pollicis باللاتين. فإت flexes the thumb. Flexor pollicis. Longus معناها اكو عندي brevis بعد عندي القصيرة. بما عندي longus لازم عندي brevis. And lastly we have the pronator quadratus in the deep area. So let's start with the superficial layer. We have four muscles in the superficial layer. From medial to lateral we have the flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis, and lastly the pronator teres. And as we مثل ما حكينا قلنا انه اغلب المسلز anterior compartment they take origin from the medial epicondyle. هذا الاوريجن نسميه common flexor tendon or common flexor origin emerge or attached to the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So the first muscle is the flexor carpi ulnaris. It has two heads, two origins. The humeral head اللي هو من أكيد من المedial epicondyle, and we have the ulnar head from the medial aspect of the olecranon process. فعندها two heads. هذا اللي نشوفه. This is the ulnar head وهذا هو humeral head, and it forms a space for the passage of the ulnar nerve that we will discuss. This muscle تمتد إلى منتصف الforearm and converts into a tendon, long tendon. تتحول إلى tendon اللي inserts into a pisiform bone اللي هو واحد من bones of the carpal bones that we've discussed. And from the pisiform bone and the two ligaments extends. The first one is called pisohamate ligament, هذا القصير اللي هو from the pisiform to the hamate bone, and the second one is called the pisometacarpal ligament اللي هو يمتد من البيزيفورم إلى الفيفث أو البيز of the fifth metacarpal bones. هذا الميتاكاربال اللي قلنا عليه بعد الكاربال bones. Nerve supply of this muscle is ulnar nerve, definitely, because the ulnar nerve passes through the two heads of the flexor carpi ulnaris. Action من اسمها flexor, it flexes the wrist joint, but also it adducts the wrist. بما انه هي جاية from the medial side, it ulnarly deviates the hand. تحرك لي الهاند باتجاه الميدلاين او باتجاه الالنر. هنا نسميه ulnar وراديال، عادة ما نسميه lateral وميديال. ف it deviates the hand ulnarly or medially. هاي الحركة نسميها adduction of the wrist joint. The second muscle is the palmaris longus. والpalmaris longus موجودة only in 15% of population حسب التكست بوك. فما نلقاها بكل population، ما نلقاها بكل الأشخاص. It takes origin only from the medial epicondyle, from the common flexor origin, and it converts into long tendon. بعدين it doesn't insert into the bone. This is important. It inserts into deep fascia, thickened deep fascia, triangular in shape, موجودة على البالم of the hand، على راحة اليد. وهذه الديب fascia اللي موجودة بالpalm of the hand called palmar aponeurosis. وaponeurosis هو modified deep fascia. deep fascia متغيرة متحولة إلى thickened layer نسميها aponeurosis. Palmaris longus attached to the apex of the palmar aponeurosis. nerve supply median nerve مثل ما قلنا. انت بس احفظ الاكسبشن بالانتيريور compartment اللي هم flexor carpi ulnaris والميديال half of flexor digitorum profundus. بعدين البقية كلهم اللي هم 6.5 6 muscles and a half supplied by the median nerve. فالpalmaris longus supplied by median nerve. What is the action of palmaris longus? بما انه هي attached to the palmar aponeurosis, it supports the palmar aponeurosis when we grip. من احنا نلزم في شيء خاصة اذا كان rounded، مثلا نلزم كرة او نلزم في شيء مدور او في شيء كروي براحة اليد we grip it ونمسكه مسكة قوية. فالpalmaris longus راح تشتغل it deepens تعمق من surface of the palmar aponeurosis. as it passes the joints، بما انه هي تعبر على الجوينتس خاصة wrist joint، فit assists in flexion of the wrist joint. The third muscle is the flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis has only one origin اللي هو humeral origin اللي هو from the common flexor tendon medial epicondyle, and also converts into a long tendon that inserts into the base of the second and third metacarpal bones. هذا الفيرست اللي قلنا thumb نسميه first metacarpal، هذا metacarpal bone. This is the second and third. It inserts into the second and third metacarpal bones. Nerve supply is by median nerve. Action is the stronger flexor of wrist joint. It is the strongest flexor muscle of the wrist joint. وبما انه هي axial ulnaris فإت شنو؟ it abducts the wrist joint or radially deviates the hand. Lastly, last muscle in the superficial layer here, pronator teres. It has two heads, two origins. The humeral head from the medial epicondyle, the common flexor origin, and we have the ulnar head from the medial aspect of the coronoid process. شوف هذا الcoronoid process وهذا medial aspect. This is the ulnar head of the pronator teres. بعدين these two heads meet together to insert on the lateral aspect of the mid shaft of the radius. بما انه جاي from medial to lateral وعابره elbow joint وعابره proximal radioulnar joint. من اسمها pronator it pronates the forearm. وده نشوفه هنا جاي from medial to lateral obliquely. طبعا nerve supply by median nerve definitely, action pronation of forearm. اللي يهمنا بالpalmaris longus بالحقيقة من نحكي على the nerves of the forearm. The two heads, the median nerve passes between the two heads of the pronator teres. So we have a demonstration here to memorize and to remember, to understand the muscles, the arrangement of muscles with the superficial layer of anterior compartment. If you do this posture, راح تخلي four fingers, medial four fingers again, the index, middle, ring, and little, باتجاه الارrangement of muscles. راح نحصل على muscles of the superficial layer of the anterior compartment وخليت الميد بالم هي common flexor origin medial epicondyle. The pronation in forearm is done by two muscles mainly, which are the pronator teres, we have discussed it, and the second one is the pronator quadratus, اللي هي muscle of deep layer of the anterior compartment. And the pronation is a rotational movement at which the following happens. أول شيء the palm of the hand turns posteriorly، تتحول posteriorly بالanatomical position it faces forward. Palm of the hand راحت الإيد. بالpronation it turns backward or posteriorly. This is number one. The second thing is that the distal end of the radius moves around the distal end of the ulna and becomes medial to it. كأنه الulna خاصة distally تتحول medial to the سوري الراديوس تتحول medial to the ulna. This rotational movement is called pronation. عكسها هي supination. وده نشوف هنا عندي two muscles اللي هم supinator راح ناخذها بالاكستنسor compartment، بس اللي يهمنا هو action of the biceps. And as you may remember بمحاضرة الارم قلنا biceps is the powerful supinator of the forearm when the elbow is flexed. So just keep this in mind. When the elbow is flexed, the main supinator of the forearm is biceps brachii. Next is the intermediate and deep layers. Intermediate layer has only one muscle اللي هي flexor digitorum superficialis. Flexor digitorum superficialis has two heads. واحد نسميه humeral ulnar head اللي ماخذ origin from the medial epicondyle of the humerus، هذا سميناه humeral. And the medial aspect of the coronoid process, هذا coronoid process. So this is the humeral ulnar head, while the radial head takes origin from the middle third of the oblique line of the shaft of the radius. نذكر الأوبليك line هو كان anterior border of the shaft of radius. فهذول two heads converge يجتمعون ويسووا لي belly of the muscle and converts into the tendon. Tendon splits into four parts, أربع أقسام. One for each finger of the medial four fingers. Medial four fingers اللي هم index, middle, ring and little. كل واحد منهم راح ياخذ tendon from the flexor digitorum superficialis. طبعا هذا التندون راح يدخل within the carpal tunnel deep to the flexor retinaculum and then diverged توسع إلى المedial four fingers. It crosses the palm of the hand يعبر على راحة اليد palm of the hand and reaches to the هذا proximal phalanges. هذول proximal phalanges هذول الميتاكاربالز اللي هو second, third, fourth and fifth. فذول proximal phalanges of the fingers. Before it reaches to the middle phalanges, each tendon splits into two parts. ينقسم إلى جزئين. كل tendon ينقسم إلى جزئين and then attached on the lateral and on the two sides of the middle phalanx for each finger of the medial four fingers. Flexor digitorum has got two heads, humeral ulnar and radial heads. وبعدين the belly of muscles وبعدين the long tendon. هذا التندن ينقسم إلى four slips إلى أربع أجزاء أربع أقسام. But then passes beneath the flexor retinaculum within the carpal tunnel and they diverge توسعون to reach for each finger. قريب على middle phalanges أو proximal phalanges. هذول each tendon كل tendon راح ينقسم إلى two slips، ينقسم إلى two parts ويسوي لي opening فتحة بالنص. وهذول two parts will be inserted into the sides of the middle phalanges of the medial four fingers. Nerve supply هو median nerve. This is the flexor digitorum profundus. Action هو flexion of the metacarpophalangeal joint, flexion of the proximal interphalangeal joint, and it بما أنه تعبر crosses the wrist joint, فit assists in flexion of the wrist joint. Deep layer, we have three muscles. First one is the flexor digitorum profundus. It takes origin from the posterior aspect or medial aspect of the olecranon process. ما تأخذ origin from medial epicondyle, and from the anterior aspect of the proximal ulna, and also from the medial half of interosseous membrane. مثل ما نشوف هنا, this is the interosseous membrane وماخذ من interosseous membrane origin. It lies deep to the flexor digitorum superficialis, لهذا نسميها profundus. وprofunda مثل ما أخذناها بالarm profunda brachii artery اللي هو deep artery. So profundus means deep. Now the muscle, the belly of muscle, converts into tendons that again divides into 4 small tendons. Again, these tendons will pass within the carpal tunnel beneath the flexor retinaculum, وبعدين هذول التندons diverge to reach each of the medial 4 fingers. When deep to the tendons of flexor digitorum superficialis, and this is important. كل tendon will runs deep to the tendon of flexor digitorum superficialis, and then crosses the phalanges to reach to the base of the distal phalanges. هذول الديستال phalanges يوصل إلى البيز of the distal phalanges and inserted there. فنشوف هنا this is the tendon of flexor digitorum superficialis of the index finger. هذا الانdex finger. وهنا نشوف هذا الاوبننج اللي هي within the tendon. وبعدين نشوف tendon of flexor digitorum profundus passes through the opening that has been made by the splitting tendon. فنشوف هنا tendon of superficialis مقسوم 2 وبعدين tendon of profundus fight within the splitting ضمن الفتحة. Innervation of nerve supply of the flexor digitorum profundus is dual innervation. حالة الbrachialis, if you remember. Brachialis كان musculocutaneous and small portion radial nerve. هنا again muscle has dual innervation or 2 nerve supply. The medial half اللي هو tendons that act on little and ring finger, وهذه مهمة تتذكرها. Part of the flexor digitorum profundus that acts on little and ring finger اللي هو medial half is innervated by ulnar nerve, while the lateral lateral half الوسط اللاترال نصف اللاترال اللي هو acts on the index and middle finger is supplied by median nerve. The second muscle in the deep layer of anterior compartment here flexor pollicis longus, and it takes origin from the anterior shaft of the radius and from the lateral aspect of the front of the interosseous membrane. تاخذ من الممبرين وتاخذ من radial bone, and it descends downward, it converts into a tendon, while the tendon also enters within the within the carpal tunnel beneath the flexor retinaculum. بس شنو lateral to the tendons of flexor digitorum profundus and flexor digitorum superficialis. فكل هذه structures pass through the carpal tunnel to reach the hand, and then it inserts into the base of distal phalanx of the thumb. Nerve supply is by median nerve. Action هو flexion of the interphalangeal joint and metacarbophalangeal joint of the thumb. The thumb has got its own muscles, and the muscles اللي هي تخصه مو ويا other muscles، وراح نعرف بعدين من نحكي على function of the thumb and in the hand function. The last one هي pronator quadratus، ومن اسمها quadratus يعني مربعة رباعية الزوايا. Pronator, it is pronator muscle, it pronates the forearm. Origin from the lower third of the medial side of the ulna, inserts into the lateral aspect of the distal lower third of the radius. Quadrangular in shape, innervation by median nerve, anterior interosseous branch of the median nerve that we will discuss, and action is basically pronation. Now, here just to emphasize the arrangement of the tendons of flexor digitorum profundus and insertion of flexor digitorum superficialis. هنا بدنا نشوف التندنز اللي هم 4 tendons of flexor digitorum superficialis. ليش؟ لأن نهايتهم قريب على insertion they will split، راح ينقسمون إلى 2 parts, 2 slips جزئين، وهذول 2 slips will insert into the middle phalanges, on the sides of the middle phalanges, leaving an opening for the tendon of flexor digitorum profundus to get through, بعدين reaching the distal phalanges. So superficialis inserts into the middle phalanges, while the profundus reach to the distal phalanges. لهذا لازم عندي opening حتى يمر البروفundus تمر عن طريقه وتوصل للديستال phalanges while the superficialis in the middle phalanges. Now the arteries of anterior compartment, we have two main arteries بالforearm اللي هما radial and ulnar arteries that they arise from the bifurcation of the brachial artery. Brachial artery leaves the cubital fossa, reaching to the apex of cubital fossa just at the level of neck of the radius, will bifurcate into radial artery laterally and ulnar artery. First, let's discuss the radial artery. Radial artery, who was a smaller branch of the brachial artery, runs laterally and goes down the forearm on the lateral aspect. من منشأ من origin مالته trans downward beneath a muscle called brachioradialis. So brachioradialis, a muscle of the posterior compartment or extensor compartment of the forearm. We will discuss it in the next lecture, inshallah. A radial artery passes downward on the lateral aspect, accompanying a nerve called superficial branch of radial nerve. Radial nerve, if you remember, when passes on the lateral border of brachioradialis, emerges from the lateral border of brachioradialis, runs in front of the lateral epicondyle. بعدين راح ينقسم إلى two branches. Deep branch اللي هو branch of the posterior compartment of the forearm, and a superficial branch. Superficial branch هو sensory. Deep branch هو motor. Superficial branch هو sensory branch of the radial nerve, descends downward راح يمشي ويا radial artery beneath the brachioradialis, and then in the lower third distally it will emerges from the medial border of the brachioradialis, and then it runs in the anteriorly in the lower aspect of the forearm just beneath the skin and the fascia. فهنا ما راح يكون الراديال artery ما راح يكون متغطي بمسل أو any tendon or structure. طبعا it will runs lateral to the tendon of flexor carpi radialis. وبعدين runs over the pronator quadratus and over the lower distal third of distal radial radius bone. هذه المنطقة مهمة بس راح نشوف ليش. Then it ends by passing on the posterolateral aspect of the wrist, posterolateral aspect. بعدين يعبر posterior to the first metacarpal bone ويدخل للhand between the bases of first and second metacarpal bones. What are the branches of the radial artery? عندي حقيقة 4 branches. The first one هو radial collateral artery. Radial collateral, فهذا يرجع posteriorly in front of the lateral epicondyle often to contribute to the formation of anastomosis around the elbow joint. The second numerous branches اللي هي muscular branches supplies the muscles on the lateral aspect of the anterior compartment of arm, and at the wrist it gives off a small palmar carpal branch. Palmar يعني anteriorly يعني باتجاه البالم of the hand. Carpal يعني carpal يعني wrist at the wrist. فهذا palmar carpal branch it contributes to the formation of anastomosis around the wrist joint. It also gives articular branch to the wrist joint. Lastly, آخر branch before it runs into the hand posterolaterally حتى يدخل للhand راح يعطيني superficial palmar branch of radial artery, وهذا راح يمشي anteriorly يعبر على فشي هنا يسموه thinner eminence, thinner muscles, وبعدين يسوي لي فشي اسمه superficial palmar arch that we will discuss later on. The radial artery supplies the thumb بالhand, the thumb and the lateral aspect of the index finger, وهذا اللي راح ناخذه بتفاصيل لما ناخذ الhand. This is the radial artery. For the ulnar artery, the ulnar artery is the larger branch and it arises from the bifurcation of the brachial artery at the level of neck of the radius, and it runs downward obliquely and medially when يدخل between the two heads of flexor digitorum superficialis, and it runs just on the flexor digitorum profundus, وبعدين it passes down the forearm on the medial aspect between between flexor carpi ulnaris and flexor digitorum profundus. Distally, it will runs lateral to the ulnar nerve, هذه المنطقة, and will passes lateral to the tendon of flexor carpi ulnaris, but it is beneath the muscles. It cannot be palpated مثل ما راح نشوف بالradial artery. Radial artery بهذه المنطقة بالlower distal aspect of the forearm, it becomes only covered by skin and deep fascia. ما عندي muscles، ما عندي شيء يغطيه، ف I can palpate it. لهذا احنا نسوي palpation للradial artery بهذه المنطقة، ولازم عندي landmark اللي هو التندن of flexor carpi radialis just lateral to it، راح احس البulse of the radial artery. ulnar artery لا، ما راح اقدر احس لان عندي flexor carpi ulnaris مغطية اغلب الراديال ulnar artery عفوا on the medial aspect. Then it reaches the carpal area or the wrist. Medial to it هو nerve, medial to the ulnar artery nerve, and passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum, فوق الفلexor retinaculum, anterior to it, وبعدين passes lateral to the pisiform, عند pisiform bone, and then it curves laterally to form the superficial palmar arch. Branches of the ulnar artery. First is the ulnar recurrent artery اللي راح ينقسم أو عندي anterior ulnar و posterior ulnar recurrent، وذول اثنيناتهم راح يرجعون superiorly proximally to contribute to formation of anastomosis around the elbow joint. Other branch هو common interosseous artery. Common interosseous artery تقريبا at the level of the radial tuberosity. راح يعطيني common interosseous passes posteriorly and laterally. Common interosseous من اسمه common فراح ينقسم إلى two interosseous branches. واحد يمشي anterior to the interosseous membrane نسميه anterior interosseous artery. واحد will passes above the superior margin of the interosseous membrane نسميه posterior ويعبر للposterior compartment نسميه posterior interosseous artery، وهذا runs parallel للanterior just behind the or posterior to the interosseous artery. The anterior interosseous artery supplies the deep layer of muscles اللي هم flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus and pronator quadratus, and reaching to the opening اللي حكيناها بالlower aspect of the interosseous membrane يعبر للposterior compartment, and it meets its counterpart يقابل صاحبه اللي هو posterior interosseous artery، وهنا كلهم راح يسووا لي anastomosis around the wrist joint. Again, the ulnar artery also gives muscular branches, the muscles on the medial aspect of the forearm definitely. Reaching to the palm, لما نرجع على ulnar artery, reaching to the wrist joint, it gives two small carpal branches. واحد anteriorly فنسميه palmar carpal، واحد anteriorly، والsecond one is posteriorly نسميه dorsal carpal. palmar carpal لأن anteriorly لأن العلاقة بالpalm، and dorsal carpal posteriorly. And then it gives off another branches in the hand that we will study it later on. طبعا distally the anastomosis between the radial artery and the ulnar artery within the hand, and also we have anastomosis at the wrist joint, as well as we have anastomosis at the elbow joint. لهذا عندنا بالتكستبوك عندنا in the clinic section، عندنا في section in the clinic addresses that any cut in the forearm، إذا صار عندي cut أو injury لواحد من الارتريز I can ligate it، أقدر أعقده وأخلص حتى ما يصير عندي bleeding. بس شنو طيب زين شلون البلد سبلاي راح يكمل للهاند؟ لأن عندي أنا another anastomosis، عندي anastomosis إذا عقدت الألنر راح يرجع لي الانستوموسيس من الراديال ويغذي لي الهاند، أو فايس فيرسا إذا أعقد يسوي لايجيشن عقده راديال ارتري راح يكمل الانستوموسيس من هالجهة ويكمل للبلد سبلاي of the hand. Here's a demonstration how we can palpate the radial artery. most important landmark النقطة ده اللي هي tendon of flexor carpi radialis. I just localize the tendon of flexor carpi radialis distally, just lateral to it, just lateral to the tendon. I can palpate the radial artery. When the radial artery هنا بهاي المنطقة راح يكون against the bone, the radius, and it's only covered by skin and deep fascia. فهذه المنطقة هي مهمة اللي أقدر أسوي بيها أحس نبض الراديال artery. This is important landmark for you as a future doctor. The veins of the forearm accompanies the artery, and two veins for each artery mostly, and they drain backward to drain into the brachial veins in the cubital fossa يكمل as a brachial veins proximally upward. The nerves of the anterior compartment, we have three nerves basically. We have median nerve, we have ulnar nerve, and we see another nerve which has no contributions بالanterior compartment of the forearm اللي هو superficial branch of the radial nerve. The median nerve مثل ما نعرف it leaves the cubital fossa بعدين it enters the forearm between the two heads of pronator teres. طبعا by the way most of the muscles اللي enter the forearm enters between two heads of a muscle. The first one is the median nerve that enters the forearm between the two heads of pronator teres وبعدين it runs down the forearm on a straight line, it runs on the flexor digitorum profundus. بعدين also it enters between the two heads of flexor digitorum superficialis just beneath the muscle. هنا يعطيني the largest branch of the median nerve اللي هو anterior interosseous nerve اللي هو it runs on the anterior aspect of the interosseous membrane between flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digitorum flexor pollicis longus, supplying the deep layer of the anterior compartment. So back to the median nerve. Median nerve runs beneath the flexor digitorum superficialis and anterior upon the flexor digitorum profundus, runs downward but then becomes lateral to the tendons of flexor digitorum profundus and superficialis. We remember that the four tendons of flexor digitorum superficialis are superior or anterior to the anterior on the front of the tendons of flexor digitorum profundus. النيرف راح يكون lateral إلى كل ذول 8 tendons. بعدين هنا يكون superficial يكون just medial to the flexor carpi radialis tendon, and it enters into the carpal tunnel beneath the flexor retinaculum. هذا مهم الموضوع هنا لأن هنا الميديان نيرف يكون عرضة إلى الانضغاط يصير بcompression، وهذا مهم راح نحكي بعدين من نحكي على النيرف injuries of the upper limb. Branches of the median nerve مثل ما قلنا يعطيني anterior interosseous nerve اللي هو supplying the deep layer of anterior compartment muscles, and it gives muscular branches لكل anterior compartment muscles except flexor carpi ulnaris and the medial half of flexor digitorum profundus اللي هم supplied by ulnar nerve. One last branch before it enters into the carpal tunnel. It emerges just proximal to the superior border of flexor retinaculum, high flexor retinaculum, high البيضة fibrous tissue. Above the superior border مالتها راح يطلع branch that passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum، وهذا طبعا cutaneous branch يغذي لي skin بمنطقة الهاند. This is the median nerve. طبعا هنا it will runs with the anterior interosseous nerve, which runs with the anterior interosseous artery. Ulnar nerve emerges from posterior aspect of the elbow, and هنا it runs behind the medial epicondyle, and then emerges into the anterior compartment of the forearm, enters between the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris, the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris, and then it passes down the forearm on the medial aspect just beneath the flexor digitorum profundus, and then it will runs the facial plane between the flexor digitorum profundus and the flexor carpi ulnaris. Just beneath the flexor carpi ulnaris ويكمل ويامن ويا ulnar artery if you remember. So it has a close relation to the ulnar artery. The ulnar artery يكون lateral ulnar nerve. وبعدين it runs over the pronator quadratus وreach to the wrist. يصير يطلع emerges from the lateral border of flexor carpi ulnaris and then runs lateral to pisiform bone. ذكر pisiform bone اللي هي attachment point مع الفلكسر carpi ulnaris, and then it runs superficial to the flexor retinaculum. It gives branches to the flexor carpi ulnaris and gives innervation to the medial half of flexor digitorum profundus. It also gives cutaneous branches in the middle third. هنا نشوف هذا واحد cutaneous branch، هذا anterior أو يسميه palmar branch، وهذا dorsal branch راح يطلعون منه، وبعدين يروحون للهاند supplying the little finger and medial half of ring finger على anterior and posterior aspect. Cutaneous innervation هذا we will be discussed later. وطبعا of course it will give articular branches للelbow and the wrist joints. Lastly اللي هو superficial branch of the radial nerve. هذا emerges from the main radial nerve تقريبا at the level of head of the radius، وبعدين it runs over the supinator just beneath منو المصل هنا كانت brachioradialis in accompanying radial artery. As we remember it runs beneath the brachioradialis بالanterior forearm، بعدين يتحول إلى posterior compartment that we will study the course of it in the posterior compartment lecture inshallah. طبعا these are tables summarizing the muscles of the anterior compartment مقسمها according to the layers. So these are the muscles of the superficial layers, all showing the origin, insertion, innervation and function. And keep in mind you need to remember and memorize the root value for each nerve. This is the intermediate layer, flexor digitorum profundus, and lastly these are the deep layer muscles of the anterior compartment. This is the end of our lecture today. Thank you.